Hello everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar on continuous testing for Agile and DevOps. And we'll look at building ADO or Azure DevOps pipelines for Worksoft Certify automation. So our agenda is, we'll first talk about it's a continuous world. What does that word mean out there? What is continuous integration, and what are those key considerations? And then we'll look at the Azure DevOps pipelines in the real world. So this is where we'll have Stan from Shanko actually explain how he's implemented, and quite honestly, it's very, very clever what he's done, taken to apply his functional test automation and end-to-end testing into the DevOps pipeline, which I think makes him kind of a unicorn, but actually really interesting out there. And then I'll do a small demo of where you get the extension for the Worksoft Execution Manager from ADO, and we'll open for questions. So it's a continuous world. So one thing that you hear is the word continuous, but the problem is you hear continuous quality. We're working on continuous delivery. We're doing continuous integration, continuous testing, continuous deployment, continuous improvement. But it's like, are they just like, whitewashing everything they're doing with the word continuous? Well, in reality, no. So if you look at like a life cycle, so the plan, prepare, explore, realize, build, test, deploy, run. Part of these are, we're mashing up some of the SAP terms for how they do life cycles for package apps, along with custom applications itself. The continuous integration is really aligns with the developers. So continuous integration came along to say, hey, developers are making a change in code. We need a central place to save and store that, and then compile that code outside of their machines in the continuous integration server so they can match all the other dependencies and things that other people are building, right? And that's where unit tests live, and people think about continuous integration. They think about ADO, Jenkins, and we did freestyle and pipeline builds and things like that. Then we get to the concept of continuous testing, which really testers and quality are concerned with. They're very interested in how do we actually test systems. Is it functionally working? Is the end-to-end working? Is all the integrations working? And we'll see the big difference between there is kind of unit level, non-deployed, code level testing versus deployed testing itself. And then we get into the concept of continuous deployment. So how can we actually move the code and build the applications, connect them to the databases, and we wanted to deploy that from the test systems to the pre-production into the production systems themselves. So all three of those actually line up together. Now, continuous improvement is the one that everybody's striving for. They want to figure out how do we get feedback from production and running and move it back into the life cycle. If you take those four things together, that is technically continuous delivery. So when people say we're doing continuous delivery, they usually have initiatives in all four of these locations. And quite honestly, they very much start from the left to the right. They'll start with continuous integration. They'll work a little bit with continuous testing, say, wow, this is hard, and they go straight for continuous deployment because continuous deployment and pipelines are fun because you get to write code. And then they come back to, oh yeah, we actually need to apply the testing that. There's nothing better than a fast pipeline that can shove bugs into production faster. And then once you do that, you're like, oh, whoops, I need to test. And actually, Stan will talk about that in his real world examples. And continuous quality is like that overarching message. So like the CTO or CIO said, we need to embrace continuous quality. And what they mean is we need to look at all of these things for continuous delivery, and how do we represent all of them together? So if we look at continuous integration or CI, basically the concept is the developers are going to write code. They commit the code into a source control system. So this could be Git, GitHub, ADO, anything like that. And then what happens is you then take that and it triggers off the CI server. So the source control says, hey, a developer's checking code, and they either do it on every event or maybe every 10 minutes on a timed event or every hour, and they start compiling the code. And then what happens is you either break the build, which means your compile messed up and you actually broke the build, or maybe your unit tests that developers wrote to test the, say, Java classes or the methods in your C#.NET code, or maybe your ABOP functionals, right, your RFC calls. You do those, and then we look at actually how do we get the results back to the developer. So really the CI server is handling, we've got code coming in from lots of people. We want to compile it in a central environment that looks a lot like production. It's got similar versions of databases and app servers and security, and report back on those unit level tests itself. Now, one thing we found is the first build is usually triggered by a source control change. Now, the thing that a lot of confusion happens is what about the testing, right? Because usually you do unit tests at that level, and in reality, you want your builds in the perfect world to be under 10 minutes. Okay, in reality, if they're under 25 minutes, most product managers are ecstatic and development managers are high-fiving, right? But the idea is you actually want to get some core, like think of your smoke tests. Is the system working? Have we broken anything at the code level? Get that done first. And then we want to have a second stage of the build in which we actually do all of our end-to-end tests. So that's why we have the two circles of the first build versus the second build itself. So if you think about that in an ecosystem, what you're going to find when you're talking to your organization, there's a million places the source control can go. In SAP, they use GitHub. You've then got your test management systems like Micro Focus and Solution Manager, or maybe X-Ray for Jira, Azure DevOps. Then you've got your defect tracking. So the idea is once you have a defect at the unit level, it should automatically submit the defect into your system so you know what's broken. Like with Worksoft, you can see results and you can right-click and say submit defect into Jira, submit the defect into ADO, into ServiceNow, things like that. And then we come back around and look at our requirements and then do this whole thing again. So even in, say, something like SAP, where we have lots of customers working, this lifecycle is being adopted. And there's a lot of supporting things there. Some of them are SAP specific, like Solution Manager, some are industry standard. So what's the big deal with this thing of like continuous integration? What's the value? Why are people saying they want to do this? Is the first step. Well, the first thing is they're going to keep everything under version control. So there's no question of what version of code is being run in production or what's in a specific build. So what happens is you have requirements that come into the system, you create change lists to meet those requirements, and you version them. The next thing is you want to automate the build. So that's where like Jenkins, TeamCity, Travis CI, they do the work of compiling the code. And then we run the unit tests as the first build. And this is usually where the developers are writing unit tests of classes and methods, looking at how calculations are working. You know, the idea is they don't really need to have the system deployed. They're not doing data persistence where you're going to the database layer and back. It's very much logic itself. And one of the key principles of like continuous integration aligns to DevOps, where you have stories and Agile, is that you have commit early and often. So you work on small bits of features at a time and commit them. So if you have a breaking change, you didn't have 4,000 lines of code changing, you had 4 lines of code changing, right? And then with each change, you want to do a build, and that's going to run your tests. Then ideally, we're going to fix the errors immediately, because if you accumulate the errors, you kind of forget the code you changed, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, what did I change? Why did this break? If you actually build every day as you check in your code, your changes are top of mind. So your defect resolution is much faster itself. Okay, and the one thing is you want to keep the build fast. Like I mentioned, that 10-minute goal, and then institute a second build to actually get your end-to-end tests and your large functional tests and your bigger regressions there. And a lot of people schedule those as off hours. They do those overnight, where they're doing the small continuous integration, compiling, and unit tests actively during the day, and then they run their 6 hours of massive regression at night as a second build. The other really key principle is that you want to test in a copy of the production environment. As Stan mentioned, one of his favorite books is the Phoenix Project. That was a big aha moment for them, that they realized that their oracles were different, their security was different, their operating systems were different. So yeah, everything works on the developer's machine, obviously. And then it moves to the CI server. So if that environment matches production, you're much better off in not having production failures itself. So what are the big key considerations is source control and change lists. And so in traditional waterfall methodologies, so if you think of like SAP and RISE-SIFs and things like that, you have a requirement. The requirement comes some code you write, you have a test case, a test plan, and it's very linear. Now, when we move to Agile, what happens is our requirements aren't documented discretely. A lot of times they're just simply acceptance criteria in a story, right? And so in an advanced pipeline, and in, say, an advanced DevOps world, when the developers get a story saying Jira ADO, they associate their code check-ins with that story, so then you should know kind of what should be tested. But a lot of times, the change lists for that aren't highly correlated to the test management system. There's not that tight coupling we used to have. So that's when it comes into having multiple sprints working parallel. They may not be on the same Agile board, so they may have different projects, say in Jira or ADO. So all of a sudden, there's lots of change lists happening in parallel. So that's why it's really key to understand that we need to do unit level testing with every build, and we really need to do as much continuous testing every day, because multiple people are changing, and they may not be aware of each other because their change lists are in different parts of the application, and they don't have that very traditional requirements to test workflows in place. So there's a big thing about understanding what is the overall business process. That is usually what lies with the developers. I mean, not with the developers, but with business. Developers think about very small features and stories, themes, and how things work together as what business people think of. So a lot of people in the development role may not realize that a change upstream affects something downstream, or a downstream change requires an upstream business change. So it's really important to consider that business needs to be involved, because they're going to have the context of how the story rolls into features into ethics itself. And the other thing is, a single process for testing one of these things can actually be hundreds of steps. Like, if you're going to actually do a return on an item, you had to sell it first, it had to be in inventory, you had to manage it, and you had to pay for the invoice, right? There's a whole bunch of things that happen upstream. Okay, one of our SAP functional leads said we really struggle with knowing exactly what to test and what our business processes are. And it's because with Agile, we're working on little pieces of code at a time, and we may not have that big picture. So when people are deploying Fiori and, say, Salesforce Lightning, success factors, all those things, it becomes a lot more complicated itself. So kind of in consideration of what to run in your tests. So if you think about, on the left side, you've got sprint teams, and those are developers doing work. They're going to start doing the continuous integration, the first build. So they do their unit level, their API tests. The things may not actually be deployed with the database in the back end. And then we'll layer in our functional regression tests. So this implies we've deployed the application. So we've got our second build in place where we're doing continuous testing. The end-to-end tests are coming into play, and this is where we're making sure that we're running in the databases and the servers and the clients where all the security updates and maintenance changes are there. There could be ERP changes that are hosted or different teams are deploying in for our end-to-end tests. Then we've got user experience. Now, one thing to remember is the developers really just understand that first brown arrow. They're just looking at unit API tests. They may not know that there was a security patch going in on Friday night, or that there was an upgrade to an ERP package. Maybe it's success factors and it's hosted. They don't know that, or Workday, something like that. So what we need to remember is continuous integration is awesome and it's the first build, but a lot of times the scope of what people understand of the big picture is limited to developers. So that's where we look at pre-production and production in that second build, where we do continuous deployment to actually move the code and actually do our continuous testing on it. And what we found is, with a lot of customers, even though they're going Agile, they really think that the center of excellence is evolving to really be associated with the second build. So they're starting to run their tests as part of their pipeline as a second build. And they want to make sure they're very reusable and scalable, and they feed into those life cycles itself. And so operations and change management are really getting better collaboration with QA to work on that second build itself. So hopefully you realize continuous integration, compiling and unit tests is not enough. We need to run them, but we need to look at, how do we do our acceptance tests from the user's perspective, maybe semi-automated? How do we handshake from one team to the next to say, okay, do we just run full regressions every night, optionally? Do we actually try to say, okay, these are the T codes or these are the transactions affected, use those, and actually control those to deployment. So the good thing is, in the continuous XXX, it is continuous integration, we'll get to continuous testing, continuous deployment. Those things all need to work together. So this was from a webinar I did with Forrester. We really talked about continuous integration and continuous testing. And in reality, continuous testing is the backbone and sits along all of the life cycle for your continuous integration. So as you're doing all of your efforts in continuous integration, we really want to think about continuous testing all along the way. You know, that could be early testing, unit testing, functional testing, moving to integration testing, moving to end-to-end testing, and then we can actually do smoke tests and say production validation tests to make sure things deployed correctly on that deployment side. So even if we're deploying in production, we may have some smoke tests to run. So really, continuous testing is going to be the backbone to support all of those efforts. So I'm now kind of giving you the theoretical background of this and how it works and what's the value of the second build. And now what we'll see is let's talk about what would an example be with the Azure DevOps, you know, because if you're using Azure to spin up your resources dynamically, that's great because you're bringing up your machines. You want to use it to orchestrate your continuous tests via the ADO pipeline. And then the goal is to actually be as fully automated as possible. So get as much automation in there as possible. Because the less manual testing we have, the more that can happen overnight and we get the defects in the morning. And so optimally, a pipeline, and say ADO would be, ask ADO to spin up your machines maybe in Azure or on-premise. You're going to set up your data, you're going to run your tests, and then based on that passing your next test, your next test, your next test, and then clean up the data. Because we find with end-to-end testing, to be able to test something at the back end of the life cycle, there's usually something has to happen on the front end, right? And so you can actually set these all up as a step in the ADO pipeline. So I think this is what I would consider like a great reference implementation or something to strive for, where you're actually not just saying, I'm going to run the tests and pass or fail. I'm actually using the capabilities of, say, Worksoft Certify and our plugin to the Azure DevOps pipeline and actually organize them really, really well. So now I'm going to pass this over so we'll see a real-world example from Stan. Stan, welcome to the call.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, so when we engaged Worksoft and started implementing automation, the problem was that all of our entire regression suite was in an Excel spreadsheet. And so in order to take it, because it's very comprehensive, very well organized, needed to take that and we needed to make it something that our QA department could understand based on their experience with this regression cycle they developed. So each suite of tests is organized into tabs in the Excel spreadsheet with maybe 10 to 40 test cases or steps per tab. And each tab is assigned different QA personnel to run these tests. And then, as Chris mentioned earlier, there's follow-on tests to each one of these tabs. So you see the R1 standard sale tab there, and then 2 tabs to the right, you see the R2 return. So the return tab requires the steps in the R1 standard sale to be completed. And so we had 3 big challenges to overcome when moving from Excel to Certify Execution Manager and Azure DevOps. And I think that's on the next slide here. Yeah, so the first challenge is how to represent the same flow from tab to tab in our Excel regression test in the Azure DevOps pipeline. The second one was how to assign specific personnel to a group of test cases, like we had done in the Excel spreadsheet. And we also needed the requirement for them to approve the tests before they ran, because in real life scenarios, we run automation against the point of sale system, and some tests will fail because of internet connectivity or some other unknown factor. Maybe we're using a test gift card, and the balance goes to 0, and so the test fails. So we needed to say we're not going to let these things run. We have to actually approve these groups of tests. Someone has to approve them. And then the last challenge was the ability to rerun failed tests, which I kind of already mentioned. So here's the solution. So trying to meet those requirements, honestly, for me, we had been using Jenkins previously, and I just couldn't imagine trying to do this in Jenkins. So I'm sure there's somebody out there who could have figured out how to do it, but I wasn't the guy. So Azure DevOps was the platform that we chose. And to meet the first challenge, we created Certify processes that would correlate to each one of the tabs in the Excel spreadsheet. So if you see there, we have Dev POSSS, which is our point of sale system, standard sale, group of test suites, and that's for regression standard sale. That correlates to the R1 standard sale tab in Excel. And if you see on the right there, it has a request ID of 4014 in Execution Manager. And so in our ADO DevOps pipeline, we have a standard sales deployment stage that executes that request ID 4014. And then you see farther to the right, as the tests flow along, we have the returns deployment stage that will then execute the correct request ID for the R2 return set of suite of tests. And so that's kind of how we met the first challenge, was by breaking up our groups of tests into separate deployment stages. So to meet the second challenge, the ability to allow people to basically sign off on a group of tests before they ran, we were able to use our existing Active Directory integration with ADO, and then we use the pre-deployment conditions available in ADO to assign specific QA personnel to each one of the deployment stages. And so you can see in approval order, there's a couple of different options that you can choose from ADO. You can say, I want all of these approvers to approve in any order, or you can say, I want them to approve in a specific sequence, or you can say any one of them can approve this particular deployment stage to kick off. And for our specific needs, we only needed one of the users in the group to kick off a specific stage.
So Stan, this really helped. Stan,
yeah,
does this really help with your concepts of governance and ensuring that the tests are meeting the requirements for the business?
It did, because, well, like I said before, if the tests were not to all succeed in a specific group of tests, then there are specific people, and I think this is what you're asking, there are specific people responsible for making sure that these tests pass correctly. Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah.
Basically, yeah. So that was one of our big concerns when we initially started putting together our regression test, was we were afraid that it would all just kick off at once and we would have to wait for everything to fail and blow up before we could provide feedback and some sort of governance. And so in the ADO deployment stage, this ability to have or to utilize pre-deployment conditions is extremely beneficial.
Cool. So you're still involving QA, but getting the automated test results to them easier.
Yep. We're giving it to them in small chunks, just like they were doing before when they would manually go through these tabs in Excel.
Okay, this is actually, I think, should get rid of any fears that people have, because a lot of times QA is like, I don't want to lose control. I'm very concerned about, when I run the test manually, I know what's happening, I see everything. But this, I think, is a nice handshake of control between the automation and people that we should consider for a lot of customers, because QA really is involved and they get first notifications and have understanding of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. And another aspect which is interesting in our particular case is that once you have a suite of tests completed on the front end through the point of sale system, we then have follow-on activities in ECC to do validation. They go into the different T codes and they make sure that everything is copacetic after these tests run. All of those tests in ECC are also being automated. So once the standard sales are finished, then there's the control gets shifted over to the SAP analysts who would normally be doing the validation in ECC manually. They're the ones who sign off and say, yeah, now I'm ready for this to run. And then when that's complete, then we can pause and look at the results of the Worksoft processes that validated in ECC before we go on to the next piece of the regression test suite.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's actually fascinating from my perspective, seeing how aligning human needs for workflow and validation steps along with automation are working together.
everyone seems to be enjoying it so far. So the last challenge, challenge number 3, was we needed to be able to rerun our specific test cases, basically, because like I said before, you have problems that happen in the system when you're automated. And so what we did was we actually structured our record sets in Certify with past fail flags. If you see in the screenshot there, you see the column step with the arrow pointing to test case 11, and then you see the CSV Certify process status has failed. So what happens is when a particular test is run, if it fails at any point, at a critical point, then that flag gets marked as failed. And then what we do, we have a screenshot here of the actual process in Worksoft Certify. Basically, is you can see there in the narrative, it says verify that the CSV Certify process status flag is equal to passed. If it is, then the next time that we run the suite of tests, it'll just skip this particular test case and go to the next record until it finds one that's failed, and then it will rerun that test. And so we end up with a really nice layout inside the Azure DevOps pipeline, because if something passes, you can see there that it's green. That means all the test cases for that particular tab in Excel or that particular suite of tests pass. If not, then it turns red, and our the QA personnel responsible for this particular set of test cases can then redeploy that one specific deployment stage inside of ADO, and it'll only run the failed test cases after they've corrected the problem. So like I said before, if one of the test gift cards we were using now has a 0 balance, they repopulate the 0 balance, or they repopulate the balance so it's able to perform the test properly, and then they can re-execute it. And then what you end up with here is, this is the flow that we were looking for. Visually represented, this is, these are the tabs in Excel that QA used to do manually. And as a bonus, additionally, you can see on the far right, there's a SAP validation for returns. But what this lets us do is flow from one suite of tests to another, find out if they've passed or not. And then we can also run things in parallel. So as you see there, once standard fails, once they all pass, then it will go on to return those standard sales, and it will also go on to validate those standard sales in SAP. And so, yeah, like I said before, I can't imagine doing something like this in Jenkins. So ADO, in summary, ADO deployment stages have really given us a level of control over the complexity in our existing regression suite. And we've been very, very happy with the results for the most part. This is still very much a work in progress, but we currently have automated about 30% of our full regression test for our point of sale system. So 30% of 450 test cases, both the front end, so the point of sale in the point of sale system itself, and the validation in ECC on the back end, about 30% have been automated so far this way. And yeah, it's been a very positive experience so far.
Yeah, Stan, from my perspective, that's huge, because you're not doing, your tests are not simple unit tests, like I clicked the button, did it press. You're actually looking at business transactions across, and I think it's really cool that you have this visual flow so you can understand how the data is flowing, what are the upstream steps and downstream steps. So I think your implementation and how you've crafted this is what I would consider like a gold standard of how I should do these type of things in ADO, because it's not just single atomic, I ran some tests. You've really done a good job of aligning QA, giving responsibilities, the notification for sign-off and failures and things like that. So I think this is, from my perspective as a product manager, I've been doing testing, so building testing software since 2005 and actually making software since the 90s. This is just huge. I think it's an amazing gold standard that to put out there for people to strive to.
I appreciate that. Another thing, like just to be completely transparent, our point of sale system is it's older. And so it's not like a brand new microservices type environment. It's a very monolithic application that works with SAP. And so we wouldn't be able to easily implement unit tests and, kind of really short tests that are fired after each build. So, working with Worksoft Certify, this has really given us the ability to actually vet the code in a meaningful way without having to expend a tremendous amount of effort, from the developers to put together a ton of unit tests on a really, really old code base. So.
Cool.
Yeah.
And so the way this works from a technical perspective is we've got our CI/CD server is going to be ADO at this point. A lot of people using Jenkins. We've got webinars. We've got YouTubes on that. And what you'll notice is the backend is still the same. We still use Execution Manager to handle the lab management for us. So the Execution Manager agents, that's where we have desktops that run, say, the point of sale. You run your SAP GUI, you run your browsers, maybe your email, your Outlook, and all those things. Those things get spun up. Execution Manager then allows you to run the tests on those. We handle the login, getting you screenshots and all those type of things along the way. Maybe we can have multiple labs behind there. So we've been very consistent from the Worksoft side, whether it's the Jenkins plugin or the ADO plugin, that we're actually leveraging the same REST calls in the Execution Manager to do that. So we're trying to be very consistent in how we're deploying these. So what I'm going to show you is what it looks like to actually get the plugin and the extension out of the marketplace. So if you actually go to the marketplace, you'll see this. So I'm gonna, in the Visual Studio Marketplace, if you search for Worksoft, you'll see there's an Execution Manager plugin here. So to get it free, we'll either download it into your, if you're signed into your instance, or it'll let you actually plug in and download it for your on-premise. And then what happens is when you log into Azure DevOps, you'll have pipelines. So I've created a pipeline here, just one, and started it off. And what happens is you're going to build tasks inside of here. So if I go edit my pipeline, what we'll see is we have agent jobs, and I want to give it a task. So if I search, once I've downloaded it into my Azure, and type Worksoft, I'll see there's the Worksoft Execution Manager. So I can add that. So now I have an execution task. So within the Execution Manager, we know that there's the concept of running a predefined request. So that's what Stan showed. He has a request, an Execution Manager, and you can give it the name of the request. Say, you can give it the email address and where you want it to live, where's the Execution Manager. Result attributes are things like if you want to pass a build number from there, or there's anything, say, in your pipeline data you want to pass in so it shows up as a certified result attribute, you can put them there, and you can put your options there. We also support output variables and such. Now, this is if you've actually pre-built your request there. What we find a lot of people do is they also can say, I actually want to specify a specific list of processes. So I can put, the process name. So if you're familiar with Certify, you think about, I have project, folder, process one, and then the next one. So I'll put a list of those in here so I can set those up dynamically even. And that lets you run those. And then there's the concept of bookmarks. And bookmarks basically lets you give it a name. And in the Execution Management, and then Management Studio, you can actually say this folder, this bookmark of a folder, say run all the tests in this folder. So if you're running atomic individual unit tests, that'll be helpful. Or you can actually say this bookmark, and I'm going to pick, say, my 5 launch starting processes. They're going to run my major end-to-end tests. You can pick them that way. Or you can actually just pick a specific process itself. So in Stan's world, he's actually picking specific requests, which are orchestrated to run the flow there, but there's a lot of ways to do that. So what we've done is, if you look at the Jenkins plugin, you now look at the ADO plugin, The plugins support three things, and they're basically running Execution Manager by sending it the REST calls to kick them off. Okay, so that means that we'll actually get the same infrastructure behind there. We just tailored the way you're building the pipelines themselves.